Hi, this is Mike, Mike's Unboxing Reviews Now 2, and on today's video we're going to take a look at the BIOS on the MSI B760-P Wi-Fi DDR4, part of their Pro series of motherboards. There isn't a great deal that we can do in here in terms of overclocking because this is a B series class board, so overclocking features are limited, although we can make some tweaks to some of the power profiles and also obviously to things like fans, turn on XMP and all those kinds of things. So let's head over to the computer and we'll take a look at the BIOS and see what we can actually change. Okay, so this is the BIOS for the MSI Pro B760-P Wi-Fi DDR4, currently in easy mode, so this is the first screen you're likely to see. Along the top here, we've got a toggle to switch between advanced and easy mode. You've got F12 to save a screenshot. If you've got an attached USB device, you can save it to there. You've got a search option here, and also options for changing the BIOS language, and also there for save and exit. Here we've got system information such as CPU core temperatures and BIOS versions, BIOS build dates, which might be useful if you're wondering which BIOS you're actually on. Underneath that, we've got our boot priorities. You can just slide those around. So if you've got a bootable USB key, you can choose if you wanted to boot from it or whether you want to boot from your main Windows disk. We've got Windows installed already, so we'll leave that as our priority. You can do a priority override for installation, and also if you're worried about a brand new system, if you've got a brand new system, it will try and boot from a USB drive before it boots to the Windows Boot Manager because it doesn't exist. So you don't have to worry too much about that. CPU speed here and DDR speed currently set to 3600 mega transfers or megahertz because we've got DDR4 in the XMP profile. XMP is already enabled. We don't have options as the Creator Genie CPU overclock in because this is a B class board. If you've got more than one profile available for your RAM, then you can have the option there. If that's highlighted, you can choose whichever one you choose to want. On the easy mode, so on the left we've got CPU, memory, storage, fan info, help, and at the bottom there we've got MFlash for flashing the BIOS, favorites, hardware monitor, and over here we've got some toggles, so CPU fan fail warning control. So if you have a CPU cooler, or you haven't got a CPU cooler, actually a fan attached to the motherboard, you can choose to override that. So that gets rid of the warnings. You've also got ERP ready, which is power management, so you can turn that on or off. If you turn it off, you'll get more performance out of your system because it will use less power saving modes. HD audio, you can choose to enable or disable that. FTPM, which is a requirement for Windows 11, that is switched on as a default. If you don't want TPM on, you can turn that off. You also got options for your virtual RAID, turn that on or off there, and also easy LED control. So if you want to turn off all of your RGBs, hit that and none of your RGB ports will work. If you want them on, leave it on. So CPU we've got, tells you about the CPU, wattages, etc, etc. You've also got in the memory, tells you what's going on, what is populated and speeds currently. You've also got storage, so it tells you what drives are connected. So we've currently got one M.2 drive, which is the Ficqua FN950, 1 terabyte in our primary slot. If we go into fan info, we'll give you a brief overview of what's going on with the fans. So the CPU fan and our system fan. There's 5 headers on here, so you can go through and choose the individual headers and make changes there should you wish to, although I think this is actually easier to do in the advanced mode. Next, you've got help, so it tells you what all the keyboard buttons do and what you can do. If you want to maybe just load the optimized defaults, you can press F6. You get the general idea there. MFlash, click on there and it'll take you into BIOS flashing mode. We've done a separate video on that, so I won't elaborate on that too much. Favorites, so if you've selected some favorites, they will all appear in your favorites list. You can choose them there. Hardware monitor takes you into the hardware monitoring side of things. We'll take a look at that later when we go through the advanced. And that is pretty much it for this section. So that is it for the basics. Let's head into advanced. So in the advanced, basically the top section is the same, but all we've got is a little bit more access here. So we've got settings, OC, MFlash, OC profiles, hardware monitor, and system security. So let's go logically. We'll start off on this side. So in here you've got your system status, so time, date, etc., and also DMI information. Advanced, so you can go into here. So PCI subsystem settings. Most of this will be set to auto. If there's anything which I specifically think you should change, I will let you know, but otherwise you're kind of free to do whatever you want with it. Now for this, the only thing I would say in here to do is to go down to resizable bar. Make sure resizable bar is enabled. That is pretty important for a lot of devices these days. And also if for some reason the above 4G memory cryptocurrency mining is disabled, make sure that is enabled. Because if you don't have it enabled, the system will only see 4 GB of RAM on your graphics card, which will hinder it significantly. Other than that, you can pretty much leave all of that as it is. ACPI settings, again, this is pretty basic stuff. So over temperature alert, you can just leave that to auto. Power LED blinking, so when the system is into kind of like a low power mode, the power LED will blink, or you can have it so that it changes color, whichever you want to do there. Integrated peripherals, this is going to be quite a good one for some people. So VGA detection, you've got it set to auto. You can also have it to ignore. If you've got onboard graphics and you want to use both, then you may want to enable those in here also. Onboard LAN controller, if you want to use the onboard LAN, that needs to be enabled. The LAN option ROM, so that's for booting over the LAN. Most people, you don't need that. Network stack, you can leave that disabled as well. And the BT tile mode, that again is something you don't need on normal PCs. It's a specific tile which you can get for kind of system tracking, that sort of thing. Onboard CNVI control module, you can leave that set to auto. And in your SATA section here, this is where you can enable or disable RAID for the SATA plug devices. Currently, all of these are disabled, or you can choose to have the controller enabled or disabled. If you're not using RAID, then you don't need that, so you can ignore that. And the last one on here is the HD audio controller, which is your onboard sound. So if you want your onboard sound to work, leave it as enabled. If you're using a separate USB or PCI Express card, set it to disabled. Intel Thunderbolt, so that's pretty much self-explanatory. So you can choose if the Thunderbolt add-in card is enabled in here, so discrete Thunderbolt support, and PCIe tunneling over USB 4, which should be left enabled. Then you've got your USB configuration. So these are set like this as default. I would leave them as they are. You can do USB port control. So if you actually want to disable any of your USB ports, you can do. Why you'd want to, I'm not entirely sure, but potentially you might want to. Maybe you've got a faulty one or something, or your case front I/O has gone faulty, then you can disable certain ports, should that be of interest to you. Next, we've got our Super I/O, so you've got your serial port and your parallel port. These are just pinouts on the motherboard. You don't actually have those physical ports, so if you don't have them, you might as well set them to disabled to be able to kind of get back some of those resources that the BIOS would otherwise use to configure them. Power management setup, so you've got ERP ready. Again, leave that off unless you want to have it enter very low power modes and be more energy responsive or efficient. Restore after AC loss, power off. So if for some reason you get a power outage, do you want the PC to turn itself back on? Do you want it to stay off? Or do you want it to be whatever it was the last state? You can choose either of those. System power fault protection, you can choose to have that enabled if you want to. If you've got a particularly bad sort of input from your mains wall, then you might want to have this enabled. Generally, people will leave this disabled. USB power at standby, so this is going to be quite important for a lot of people. So if you want your USB devices to remain active when the system's in either sleep mode or in soft off modes, then obviously set this to whichever is appropriate. Default is disabled. If you want enabled, so USBs will still be on when the PC is basically turned off. So for charging devices, yeah, those kinds of things. If your keyboard's annoying you, your mouse is annoying you while you're trying to get asleep and your PC's off but the keyboard's on, set this to disabled. Next one, you've got your BIOS mode, so CSM or UEFI. This is best left to UEFI for modern Windows operating systems. If you're trying to use older stuff in here, older graphics cards, or maybe a hard disk drive or SSD or M.2 drive, which was formatted or created on an older version of maybe Windows 7 or Windows 10, it may be in CSM mode, which is compatibility mode. So if for some reason you've plugged in a hard drive and it's not recognized, you might want to switch that to CSM support mode. Wake up system events, you can choose by the BIOS, real-time clock, network device, Intel CNVI, USB device if you want the system to actually turn on if you click your mouse button, or resume from sleep or hibernate by pressing a keyboard on your mouse, then you can choose those. So they're all set to disabled. Again, for the PS2 mouse or PS2 keyboard, if you've got either one of those connected, you can choose to have those enabled, so you can do kind of click to wake rather than having to press the power button. Secure erase is for securely erasing SSDs, if you want to use that. You've got the MSI driver utility installer. I've got this set to enabled. This potentially is possibly problematic. If you don't want MSI Center and the drivers and stuff installed, then you might want to leave this disabled. Arguably it's got pros and cons either way, but you can enable it or disable it from here. DTM is desktop message, so this is mostly used by OEMs to pre-configure it, so maybe the MSI screen doesn't come up and it comes up with either Dell or whatever manufacturer it is, so you can choose to use that. You also got your NVMe self-test and AMD graphic driver health. If you've got an NVIDIA graphics card in there, it will show NVIDIA. If you've got an Intel one, it will show Intel. Don't really do anything in there, but it is there. Next, we've got our boot options. So in the boot option, you've got your full screen logo display. So if you don't want that, you can disable it. Go to BIOS. There's an option of doing that. So if you press the power button for 4 seconds, when you boot up, it will go directly into the BIOS rather than you having to press delete. So potentially that might be useful. You've got your boot up numlock state. So I've got it set to on because I use a full size keyboard and I like to use number lock or the number pad. So that is enabled. You get the general idea. Then we've got our fixed boot order. So that is the boot order that we looked at earlier up in the boot priority section. And at the bottom, we've got our BBS priorities. So if you've got more than one hard disk drive or M.2 or SSD, you can choose which one is the primary in the BBS section. So if you've got more than one drive, that could be useful if Windows isn't booting for some reason. That's pretty much it for that section. Obviously, next one, you've got save and exit. So you can discard the changes if you're not sure. You can save changes and reboot, just save changes. You can discard changes, restore system defaults, and also in this section, you can do your boot override. So say for instance, you've already got Windows installed, then Windows will always try and load from the Windows Boot Manager shown here. But if you've got a USB device connected, then you can choose that and that will be your next bootable device on the next reboot, but only for that reboot. It won't be a permanent setting. So that is it for settings. So now let's delve into the OC section. So you've got options here for expert or normal. Doesn't really make a great deal of difference, just got more settings there. So you've got your P-core ratios, you can change those if you want to. Advanced CPU configurations, if you go into here, you've got hyper-threading, you can turn it on or off. You can turn on or off certain P-cores, should you have a need to, for possibly older operating systems or maybe older games. Legacy game compatibility mode kind of does the same thing as well. Intel Adaptive Thermal Monitor, you can enable or disable that. Your C states, your C1E support, so again that's like a low power saving. C state limits you can change. Intel Speed Shift Technology you can change. EIST, so that is the advanced or enhanced Intel Speed Step Technology. In fact, for some 13900, 14900K processors, not that you're going to use it on this board, but maybe you do, you can actually disable that, which actually does make the system a little bit more responsive in certain instances. You've got Intel Turbo Boost. Now, this is one which is actually quite important. You can change these, and if you know what you're doing, it can be useful. So currently we've got our long duration power limit. So this is our PL2. So you can change that to a limit which is suitable for your specific processor or what it can potentially kind of max out to. If you're using a lower end processor, like a 65 watt part, like the 12400, it's not really much point changing this. Generally, that isn't going to draw much more than about 100 about 100 watts or so, 110, maybe 120. So you can just set it to the long duration of auto and it'll be absolutely fine. How long it's maintained as well. And also you've got your short duration. So that is your PL1. Long duration's PL2, or is that round the other way? I always forget that, but regardless, that is your power limits. So you can set those manually should you wish to, and also the current limits. Again, most of this you're probably just left best to auto. If you want to do kind of sort of underclocking, then you can set your wattages lower than the recommended defaults to make the processor not use so much power. It may be a little bit slower, but it will run a little bit cooler. You've got your CPU light load control, light load over temp protection, and your DMI link speed. So that is the link speed between the processor and the chipset. You can choose to lower that if you want to, but it defaults to Gen 4. Going back to here, so we've got microcode selection, AVX support, so you can turn that on or off if you want to. Your ring ratios, CPU cooler tuning. This is one that actually is quite useful and can actually make a big difference. So you go into CPU cooler tuning. Generally, this will come up the first time you power up the system anyway. But you've got your PL1 limits. So this is your kind of your peaks. So if you set it to box cooler, your processor can only ever use a maximum of 65 watts. If you set it to tower air cooler, you can have a PL1 limit of up to 253 watts. And if you're on a water cooler, it's now got the new setting of 253 watts also, whereas previously that was some ridiculous thing like 4,000 watts or something. So it doesn't really make a difference if you choose tower or water cooler. You might as well choose water cooler if you've got a pretty decent CPU tower cooler on there. I would avoid using the box cooler one unless maybe you're using some sort of small form factor build and you want to actually limit the wattage going to your processor to keep the temps down. You can play around with those two, see which performs better for you. I would say tower air cooler or water cooler are going to be your best options. Next up, we've got our DRAM settings. So this is essentially turning on XMP on or off, enabled or disabled. You've got your RAM reference clock, your CPU to DRAM clock. Most of this just leave as auto. It's going to be absolutely fine. You've got your DRAM frequency, so you can change. If you've got RAM which is like really high frequency, which the system doesn't really support, you can choose what you want in here in various different gears. So I could actually change this. I'm running 3600, so I'm currently in gear 2. I could set it to gear 1, maybe get better performance. Again, probably best off leaving it as auto, unless you really know what you're doing, or you've got time to tweak these settings. You've got your DRAM timing mode, so you can have it linked, auto, or unlinked, so whether it runs synchronously or whatever the other word is that isn't synchronously. Asynchronously, I think it probably is. Memory fast boot, you've got that option, so for RAM training and stuff like that. Probably best leaving this to auto on a DDR4. You've got fast boot when OC fails, voltage settings, digital power you can go in, load line calibrations, all that kind of stuff. CPU core voltage offset mode. So if you actually want to undervolt, then you can go into here and set it to a negative, and then you can set your offset. So say for instance we want to reduce this a little bit, so I'd set it to 0.05. That is a pretty safe bet that that's going to work fine with pretty much most processors. 0.1 is unlikely, 0.75 you might get away with. Depends on the processor and other things, but generally 0.5 will be absolutely fine now. Should reduce your temperatures a little bit. I don't really need to on this, but maybe I'll set it to 0.025. Because that is a very slight decrease. And actually I'm going to do a test after and see if this does improve. I don't think it will do a great deal. You will get a warning there saying your system might get unstable, so yeah. Do what you like there, the choice is yours. You've got your same sort of thing with your E-cores as well. You can go through, there's basically all of your voltages there you can tweak should you want to. Your DRAM, if you're overclocking your RAM, you might want to up the voltage a little bit. Obviously don't push it too hard. PCH voltages, DRAM voltages, you get the general idea. Memory OC retry. So if you're overclocking your RAM, there's an amount of times that it will try before it fails. You can choose disabled or always retry, so just keep on trying. Probably best to set it to 2. And then you've got your CPU memory change detect. So if you change your RAM out, it will detect the fact that it's got new RAM in there and it will kind of reset the settings for your RAM. Then you can go in and reset them in the BIOS rather than it trying to remember previous settings and possibly running at clock speeds that it really can't. Next up, we've got our CPU specifications. So it tells you about your CPU, cores, stepping versions, etc. And the technology support, so MMX, SSE, etc. Then you've got Memory Z, which will basically read the SPD chip on your RAM, say what brand it is and the clock latency is, etc. CPU features, so this might be useful. So you've got your limit CPU ID maximum, you've got your virtualization, so whether or not you want to have virtualization enabled or not. The VTD tech, control IO, MMU, pre-boot behavior. Yeah, again, this is all set as default, so you're probably best off just leaving this unless you have a reason not to. And I think that is pretty much it for here. So I was a quick scroll through. I think we've covered pretty much everything. Yep, that is it. So that is the OC section. So next one, you've got M-Flash. So if you click on there, it'll say the system will reboot and enter flash mode. Do you want to enter flash mode? We don't at the moment, but if you want to, you can do. Again, we've done a separate video on that, so you can check that out for yourselves. Next up, we've got our OC profile. So if you've got overclocking profiles, you can save them, and then you can potentially swap between them, see which one gives you better performance, and then you can choose ones which are best for certain applications. You've also got, you can load from ROM, or you can save them to a USB stick, or you can load them from a USB stick. Now we've got hardware monitor. This is one I like to use frequently to set up my fans, make sure everything's all good. So a brief overview. So top left, we've got the temperature. So this is where the system is going to actually read the temperature sensor. So you've got 5 sensors in total, one for the CPU, one underneath the CPU in the CPU socket. You've also got a system one, you've got your MOSFETs, and also you've got your chipset or PCH. So for the CPU, if you go into the CPU fan here, actually before we do that, that is the fan control, so that's all the headers. So you've got your CPU, the pump header for your AIO, and then you've got your 5 system fans. On this side, you've got PWM and DC, and also your temperature source, which is the same as this effectively. You've got your step up time and step down time. So this is how quickly the fans are going to react to changes in temperature. So basically it's going to be 0.1 of a second. So it's going to be almost instantaneous. If you want a slower ramp up and slower ramp down, you can change that if you want to. Although I would say really you probably want your cooling to react to your system as quickly as it can. But you may find that is a little bit distracting. But it is distracting, but you'll get lower temps. If you have a lower step up time, the CPU is going to get hotter whilst it waits for the fan to kind of catch up with whatever is actually going on your system. Hopefully that makes sense. So CPU, again, you can turn on smart fan mode. If you don't, it'll just basically be dumb, and you can just move that around to a constant speed. Also, you've got the option for PWM or DC. So PWM is for 4-pin fans which are connected. If you've got a 3-pin fan, older style one, you can choose the DC, and it'll run on voltage rather than a pulsed width modulation circuit actually in the fan itself. So again, back to the CPU. So you've also got auto on there as well to auto detect. So our CPU, if you want to increase the fan speed, you just raise these up, and you should see if I raise that up enough, you'll see this bar graph will move. Sorry, no, that line there is the CPU temperature. So yeah, that isn't going to change. I was thinking it was the MSI center, not the BIOS. So anyway, that is how to set your fans. So this is the low speed, this is the high speed, and it relates to what you can see on the left and also at the bottom there. So at the moment, this is set to run at 100% at 80 degrees Celsius. If you want it to be 100% at 70 degrees Celsius, slide it along, and you can basically just move these around until they make sense for you or keep your system cool. Temperature sources, you can choose again for the CPU itself. You really want to keep it set to CPU or CPU socket perhaps. I would leave it as CPU personally. For the pump, same sort of deal, so you can choose whether it's PWM or DC. Also, you can enable smart fan mode and drag these to wherever you want to. If you are using an AIO, it's probably best to have it sort of pretty high all the way along. If your pump isn't very noisy, then it might be worth actually just leaving it at 100% all the time anyway, just to keep it as a constant flow rate. Again, entirely up to you, whichever you do. You can also change the temperature source again, as we said. System fan 1, so this is doing pretty much the same thing. So this is using the CPU as our temperature source. The graphics card will take care of itself because it's got its own fans in, but if you have another fan which is near the graphics card, maybe system fan 2 perhaps, you could change this as your temperature source to be the, say, PCH, and that will increase, or system. System might be a good one, because that's going to be the overall system motherboard temperature, which is going to be influenced by the graphics card. Again, choose these however you want to, just make sure you have them set to PWM or DC, whichever is appropriate to your system. At the bottom there as well, just in case you're wondering, so you've got your CPU temperatures, your CPU socket temperatures, system temp, MOSFET temp, and the chipset temperature. So those you can see in real time in centigrade and Fahrenheit. You can as well set all fans to full speed. You can set all to the default, so if you make a mistake here, you can reset all to default, or you can all set cancel, which will just basically revert to whatever they were before you started messing around with them. Also at the bottom, you've got your voltages, so your CPU core voltage, your CPU auxiliary power, CPU SA, and your DRAM voltage. System 12 volts, so we're currently at 12.6, which actually seems a little bit on the high side, but rather it be a little bit over than be under, because that can cause other problems. Our 5 volts is at 5.1, it's absolutely fine, and our 3.3 is at 3.348, which is pretty much perfect. Couldn't ask for better. So yeah, that is the hardware monitor. So you can look at your system diagnostics there. Again, it's good to do it in the BIOS because there's no software running to actually control any of it. So this is going to be your most accurate attempts. And last one, we've got our system security. So you can set an administrator password to access the BIOS if you want to. You also can configure a U key if you've got a USB key for logging in. You also got trusted computing, so TPM will need to be turned on. This is how you enable it in here. So just enable your TPM. Also, you can reset the TPM keys should you ever need to. Just obviously, if you do, make sure you've got a copy of them. But yeah, that's all of your TPM and security there. You also got your chassis intrusion configuration. So there's a little dip switch on the motherboard. Certain cases have got a little kind of toggle switch or push button switch. So if the chassis has been opened, it will notify administrators or in the BIOS, that sort of stuff. So no one ever uses that, but I thought I'd mention it anyway. Next one, you've got Secure Boot. Again, you will need to have this enabled for Windows 11. As standard, it comes with Secure Boot enabled and also the Secure Boot mode. So if you leave it to standard, that is basically what you want to do. You can make your own custom Secure Boot modes. You can configure certain things. So if you're using a non-Windows operating system, which requires a specific type of Secure Boot key, then you can change that there. And also you've got your key management, which you can change if you have a kind of custom setup. But realistically, Secure Boot, just leave that left on unless you're using a really old operating system or a non-Windows operating system. So that is pretty much it. So yeah, any questions or any parts on there that you don't fully understand, feel free to let me know in the comment section. I'll do my best to help you. As always, we do answer all the questions that we get if they're new questions. If you're answering on or asking a question which is part of an existing thread, it's really hard for us to keep track of those. So please, if you've got a question, or maybe you've asked a question in another thread that hasn't been answered, just stick a new question on the video and we'll do our best to help you out. Alternatively, you can head over to our Discord, completely free to join, jump into one of the tech support rooms, or just drop into one of the general rooms for a chat about computers or the weather or politics or whatever you want to talk about. It's absolutely fine, but we do have dedicated rooms available for tech support should you need it. So there you go, there is a tour of the MSI Pro B760-P Wi-Fi DDR4. Hopefully this video has been useful to you and maybe even somewhat entertaining or educational. You never know, could be one of those things. If it has been, leave a like on the video. If you want to see more content like this on a daily basis, maybe consider hitting subscribe and the chime notification. That way you will be notified of future video releases. But for now, I've been Mike. This is Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and hopefully we'll catch you in the very next video. Thanks for watching.